All right, welcome everybody to the Daily Huddle. My name is Dr. Monica Ogando. This is Spiritual Matters Thursdays, and today we're talking about whether vulnerability is a superpower or a liability. And I said at the beginning, before we started streaming, both. Both. It depends. It is, number one, depends on where you're coming from with it, and number two, where it's landing. Okay? Because I'm going to use an analogy of in nature, right? That water, for example, can be a healing, cleansing, uh, joyful agent, just like if you were to use it at a spa, if you were to use it to drink, if you were to use it to wash, if you were to use it to cleanse your body or your property, etc. And it can also be a death trap if you drown in it, if it is a hurricane, if it is a tornado, et cetera, et cetera. So just as with everything in nature, just as with everything in our internal emotional world, vulnerability too can be a liability or a superpower depending on where you come from with it, how you use it, and where it lands. And so first, let's define vulnerability, because if you were to look it up, if you were to go to Merriam-Webster, the dictionary right now, and you were to go and look for the word vulnerability, okay, the way that it would define that word is open to attack or damage, capable of being physically or emotionally wounded, liable to increased penalties. So when you take those three definitions together, open to attack or damage, like assailable, or capable of being physically or emotionally wounded, or liable to increased penalties, yeah, nobody wants to be vulnerable. What? No, thank you. I'll pass. However, if we define vulnerability as disclosing authenticity, if we define vulnerability, and this is not in the dictionary, okay, this is me sharing another possibility with you. If we can define vulnerability as disclosing authenticity, if we can define vulnerability as open to connection and relationship, then vulnerability is very much a desired trait. Now, I want you to think back to any kind of moment that you've been with someone, friend, colleague, maybe even somebody that you're not close to, maybe somebody that you saw on stage speaking, a thought leader, et cetera, a celebrity even. And when they were speaking about something that was near and dear, tender to their heart, when they were open to and disclosing authenticity, okay? Your response to that might likely have been, wow, that's so powerful, so brave that you disclose that, right? We look up to that level of vulnerability. We feel more connected to the person because of their initiation of that level of vulnerability of disclosure, right? We do not think of them as, oh, great, now I have an opening to attack them, right? Now I have an opening to damage them, to wound them physically or emotionally, to increase their penalties, right? We don't think that way when somebody is being vulnerable in front of us. We think of it as, wow, that was really brave. And I feel more connected to that person because they disclosed that level of authenticity to me or in front of me or whatever the case may be. And it increases our empathy, it increases our connection, it increases our willingness to give them the benefit of the doubt or whatever it is, right? Being patient with their journey, etc. However, we are very reticent to be vulnerable ourselves. We think it makes us look stupid. It makes us look like we don't have it together. It makes us look like we are perhaps open to physical or emotional harm or damage, or that we're going to pay some kind of price, some liability of increased penalties. Maybe it's going to be weaponized against us at a later time, and it's going to come out in a way that we don't want, that we can't control, et cetera, et cetera. So we don't do it. We withhold ourselves. How many of you have had that experience? That when you witness somebody else's vulnerability, your empathy and your connection to that person, or maybe even respect for that person, goes up. But when it's time for you to disclose your vulnerability, you have it like it is a liability. Like, I don't know if I want to do that. Makes me feel like I'm risking something that I don't want to risk. Put a one in the chat if that's you. That you feel like your vulnerability is painful, embarrassing, makes you look weak, makes you look like you don't have it together, makes you look like you need help, like you're just this, incapable thing. But you don't necessarily see other people like that when they are disclosing their vulnerability. True, true. I see ones in the chat. Yeah. So what makes the difference? What makes the difference? Why is it that when somebody is displaying their vulnerability, it touches you at the empathic and the empathy or the connection level, but when you do it, you interpret it as though it's weakness or it's embarrassing, et cetera, et cetera. I'll give you something to consider. I'm not saying that this is the truth. I'm just saying, just consider. Just consider it. Consider that perhaps the reason why we have it like that, like this dichotomy of when they do it, it's fine and it's lovely and it's empathic and it's, all this other stuff. When I do it, it's embarrassing. Consider that when you are, oh my, that was an Amber Alert. Consider that when you are looking at somebody else in a state of vulnerability, you're connecting to their humanity. And when you are opening up your vulnerability, you're disconnecting from yours. I'm going to say that again. Consider that when you are looking at somebody else's vulnerability, you are connecting to their humanity. And when you are disclosing your vulnerability, you are disconnecting from yours. What do I mean by that? It is quite human. It is part of the human experience to experience the depth and the breadth of human emotion, particularly those emotions that we are uncomfortable with, that we sometimes even feel ashamed of: anger, embarrassment, sadness, guilt, despair, regret, right? What has been called before the dark emotions. And when somebody is experiencing some kind of dark emotion, we lean in, we're like, wow, okay. It's an opportunity for us to serve them, to help them, to be there for them, etc. And we don't mind doing that. But when it comes for us to receive that level of help, support, empathy, connection, etc., we tend to shy away from it because it discloses our humanity. And when we were younger, in our family of origin, in our household of origin, etc., perhaps, and again, tell me if this is true. If I might be wrong, but if this resonates, tell me this is so me, or this is like me, or whatever in the chat. When we were in our family of origin, we got love and attention and approval by having it all together. There's a checklist of things that you needed to do and be in order to be okay. You needed to eat your vegetables, you needed to make your bed, you needed to clean your room, you needed to do the dishes, you needed to get good grades, you needed to not argue with your brother or sister, you needed to not make a mess, you needed to not yell, you needed to not run around in the house, you needed to not get dirty. There was a list of things that was like, if you do these things, you'll be all right. And mom won't be mad at you, or dad won't be mad at you, or they won't punish you, or they won't hit you, or they won't embarrass you, or send you to your room, etc., etc. The price for being an ebullient child sometimes was social isolation. They send you to your room, or you can't have dinner with the family, or you go stand in the corner, time out, right? And so you learned that you needed to equip yourself and fashion yourself in a particular way in order to be socially accepted. Because the price of coloring outside the lines, as it were, would be social isolation or corporal punishment. And so you kind of grew up with that subconscious belief of, I've got to keep it together so that I can be socially acceptable, so that I can move, not embarrass myself, or not bring shame onto the family, or, not risk this job, or not risk this promotion, or not risk this marriage, or not risk this, whatever the case may be. Michelle says there's risk involved. Absolutely. Yes, there's risk involved in every decision. And the question is, which risk is acceptable to you? Because there is also the risk of self-abandonment, of self-betrayal. And for some of us that grew up thinking that it's better to do for others than to do for ourselves, the risk of self-betrayal is worth paying that price. Yes, Laura says I have to adhere to societal and family rules. Because if I don't, then what? And we fill in the blanks, right? Some of the work that I do with my private clients is, they come and present a business problem, like we need more sales, or I need my team to be, right butts, right seats. I want to make sure that we are in good communication, and make sure that this person is on their way to succession planning, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of leadership development that I do inside of my private work with clients. But when we really start talking, when we really start delving deeply into leadership tenets and practices and strategies, et cetera, we end up talking a lot about mom and dad and God. And you would think, well, why would a grown person need to talk about mom and dad or God for that matter? This is not a religious thing. It's not a spiritual thing, et cetera, et cetera. But I'll have you know that 99% of business problems are a self-mastery problem in disguise. A leadership problem in disguise. It is an identity problem in disguise. Who you say you are. You've heard me say this, right? And so with vulnerability, you are disclosing a part of you that perhaps you yourself have not yet fully integrated, right? Let me give you an example. Some people, when I disclose, for example, that when I was a child from the ages of 8 to 10, I was sexually abused by an uncle on my mother's side, one of her brothers. And I had to undo a lot of the messaging or what is the word I'm looking for? The self-mutilation and the self-punishment that I learned from all of that, from the guilt and the shame of that experience. But when I speak about that experience now, it does not feel like a vulnerable disclosure. It feels like I'm telling you what I had for breakfast. I have already integrated those lessons. I have already integrated that experience. I have already healed a lot of the pain and the shame and the guilt and the what ifs and the oh my godness of that experience through a lot of the work that I've done throughout the years. Right? But I have to be also conscious of the fact that just because I've done that internal work doesn't mean that it lands that way when I communicate it to someone. They too might have been the victim of childhood sexual abuse, and they may not have integrated their lessons. So for them to hear my story feels like, oh my God, another person like me, somebody that can relate to my experience, right? But also, oh, why are you talking about it like it's just breakfast when I feel this much pain? So that too can be a sense of like disconnection, because it's like we have this common experience, but it's not landing with you the way it's landing with me, right? And so when you are communicating, and this might delve more into the Tara in Communication Wednesdays, Tuesdays, that when you are communicating with someone, you have to be conscious not only of how you're launching your communication, but also how it's landing, right? And vulnerability is the entire journey. Vulnerability is not only where it comes from for you, but also where it lands. when you're communicating something, when you're being in relationship with someone, right? We are living in a culture, in a generation, in a time where a lot of what makes us human has become performative. Our vulnerability has become performative. Our passion for certain social causes has become performative. And a lot of what makes us human has, for a very long time, have become monetizable. And so it is to be expected, and sometimes even to be understood, that some folks may have a level of cynicism around displays of vulnerability. Like, yeah, okay. Right. And that's why when we show up in authentic vulnerability, authentic disclosure of our humanity, and of something that perhaps feels close to the vest, something that you don't necessarily share to everyone and in every reason, in every room, when you share something like that, then it feels special, especially when it comes from a genuine place. And so we use it with discernment. That's why I said that it depends, because it could be both a vulnerability. A vulnerability can be both a liability and a superpower. Yeah. The truth out of turn. I heard somewhere, I don't know who said this and I don't know where it comes from, but I heard it and it stuck with me. Someone once said in front of me, not to me, but in front of me, that they said, the truth out of space and time can be worse than a lie. In other words, the truth, when it's not the time to tell the truth, or when it's not the space to tell the truth, can sometimes be as harmful as an outright lie. And I always thought, well, that's interesting, because I thought the truth is what counts no matter what. But there is a time and place. There is such a thing as reading the room. And part of what makes vulnerability a superpower is the ability to deliver it in a way that feels useful. Useful to you to get it off your chest, and useful to the other person to create connection or empathy. Yeah. So I want to open it up and see where you are with this. Do you consider yourself to be a vulnerable person? Are you the one that's disclosing yourself to your friends or loved ones or family? Or are you like the stoic one, the one that people come to with their vulnerability, and you kind of hold people's secrets? I would love to hear where you stand with this vulnerability conversation. So come on up, raise your hand, let me know where you stand with this. Let's have a conversation. Where are you at with it? Let's see. Who's gonna raise their hand?
Well, I'll start. I'm just kind of an open book. I just throw it all out there.
Uh-huh.
I don't hold anything back. It's whatever there is, there is.
Mm-hmm. Is that just like that's just your rule for living, or does that depend on the relationship or the situation or how you're feeling? Just kind of like your modus operandi.
No, just yeah, whatever fits the conversation at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
I don't hold anything back. If somebody mentions suicide, I talk about my children. I understand. I don't shy away from the conversation. If somebody talks about being from a foreign country, oh, I'm from a foreign country. Just anything that's relevant to the conversation,
Mm-hmm.
I don't hold back.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that creates a certain level of openness, permission for the other person to also be open with you and disclosing with you, etc. Would you find that that's kind of like your experience? People are like, oh, if you're gonna be open, I'm gonna be open.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It kind of breaks down barriers, finding common ground.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good stuff. Thank you for sharing. That's awesome. Who else has something? I think I saw Laura's. Yeah, Laura, here you are.
Hold on. I did raise my hand. Yes, I. must say I am vulnerable with some people. Depends on my spiritual and energetic connection
Yeah.
with the person because I'm still sometimes operating from a place of judgment. Depends on, the level of consciousness with the person and all of that. But
Mhm.
yes, I can be very, very vulnerable.
Mm.
And I'm in the process of sharing and writing my story. And
Oh,
I
okay.
find, yes, that some things that I'm sharing, like I have to let go. It's like I'm releasing these fears of judgment and just putting it out there.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, whatever it is, I'm just letting it go.
Yeah,
Thank you for this conversation. Thanks.
absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, so part of um you bring up something interesting because sometimes what we consider to be a vulnerable share could sometimes land like emotional vomiting to somebody else who maybe doesn't have the bandwidth for it or doesn't have or doesn't interpret the connection to be able to sustain that level of intimacy, etc. And so I like what you're saying here, Laura, about the depending on the situation, depending on the relationship, there's some places where it feels appropriate to disclose something like that. And then there are others where it feels out of place and kind of weird. And part of that, I think, has to do with the permission, the connection, the intimacy that has been built into that relationship or not. And whether you assume that the other person could have the bandwidth or the willingness to hold space for something. Sometimes you don't have the room, but you suspect they have the bandwidth and the capacity and the willingness to hold space. And so you take a risk and you disclose something vulnerable. And then there's sometimes when you disclose something vulnerable, you're like, oh, shouldn't have done that. And you have what people call vulnerability hangover. You're like, oh God, now I'm embarrassed. I wish I could take it back. And it passes. Just like every hangover, it passes. And then don't do that again. Now you've lived and learned and got loves, right? And so, but all of it comes with, taking that risk. And life is all about that. I was sharing with a private client of mine yesterday in our coaching session that we are born into risk taking. We are born into always exposing ourselves to the unfamiliar. From the moment you are born, you are thrust into an unfamiliar situation. Because when you were being cooked in your mother's womb as a little seed, and then you grew into a full-fledged fetus and you outgrew your mother's womb and you had to come into the world, you had to get familiar with inside of there, you were breathing water. Inside your mother's womb, you were breathing water. Your lungs were not activated yet. And as soon as you were born into this world, somebody has to smack you in the bottom and kind of like activate your lungs so that you can begin to breathe oxygen. And that's what you're going to do for the rest of your life. But when you're born, you've never done that. You've never been outside in oxygenated environment. This is new. And even though you've been inside of your mother's womb, you've never seen her face. You've never been in her arms. This is new, right? And so we are born into uh, leaving the familiar and going into the unfamiliar. So the idea that it's so terrifying and so unique and so vulnerable. You've been doing this since the moment you were born. The entire curriculum of life is you exposing yourself to the unfamiliar and getting comfortable with it and getting confident with it and taking a risk. That's all you're doing day in and day out. And we think that living a good life is somehow mitigating those risks. I don't know who told you that, but you've been lied to. Now, I'm not saying don't uh, mitigate risks. I'm not saying be careless out there. right? That again, discernment is important. But don't act like this, taking risk is somehow this earth-shattering thing that you just are not equipped for. You were born for this. You were born into it. Yeah. And so vulnerability, although it may be true that in some cases you are opening yourself up to physical or emotional harm, because maybe the person will reject it, or maybe the person won't be there to support you. Maybe they don't have the capacity or the bandwidth or the willingness to be with you the way that you want them to be with you, etc. That, although it might sting, it also fortifies you. And this is the part that we don't talk about with vulnerability, or with risk taking, that every time that you take a risk, whether it turns out or not, every single time that you take a risk, you fortify your character, because you get connected to your resilience. You get connected to your courage. You get connected to your imperturbability. And whether that person receives you or not, at the end of it, you're like an Elton John song, like, I'm still standing. I didn't die. All is still well. You may not like your results. You may not like your feedback. But did you die? It might have felt like a little death emotionally. Maybe your ego took a hit, but you're all right. And you're all the better for it, because even if you didn't get a blessing, you got a lesson. And this is what makes you imperturbable. It's what makes you wise. It's what makes you discerning. It's what makes you useful for somebody else. When you impart your lessons onto somebody else, so that they perhaps don't have to trip over the same stone that you tripped over, and so that together we raise the tide for all boats. So continue to use the discernment that you have earned throughout your life in your vulnerability. But don't let the pain of past vulnerabilities stop you from the joy of the connection that it creates. So thank you, everybody, for being here in another Thursday Spiritual Matters. I appreciate you so much. Thank you for participating. Remember to love generously, to give of yourself, your time, your attention, to laugh. Laughing resets your chemicals in your brain and opens you up for discovery, for joy, for vulnerability, for passion, for creativity. Get yourself at least 7 or 8 hours of sleep. Eat more plant-based, stress less, exercise more. Remember that twerking is a Kundalini raising exercise, a spiritual practice. And of course, check yourself before you wreck yourself. Always audit your assumptions. We love you. See you next time.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.